Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait a minute or two as people cycle in, but I'm glad that people are coming in quickly here. So we'll be starting in a minute or two. Again, everybody coming in, I'm welcoming you. We're just waiting a couple of minutes till people cycle in and are able to log in, and then we'll get started. Looks like we have over 200 people so far, so we'll wait another minute. Erica, there was a question about whether this will be recorded. It will be recorded. I didn't catch the rest of the question, whether there's more to it than that.
Sure, just will the link be available once it is recorded? So I'm going to go ahead and answer that in the chat now, but yes.
Okay, very good. All right, we're going to get started. I know more people are coming through, and but we'll speak slowly and people can keep coming. First of all, just hello, everyone. I'm Cindy Rivera. I am the School Counseling Department Chair here at New Canaan High School. I'm glad to see so many people joining us. This evening, we're going to introduce you to our guest speaker after a bit, but he is here for about an hour, and we'll have a discussion for a little bit, and then hope to answer some of your questions. So if you post your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom, then we will have some time to look at those and hope to get to some of them. So tonight, we have with us Jane Mitchell and Erica Shadler with me, who are on the counseling side with me and are going to be moderating tonight. But more importantly, we have our guest speaker, and we'd like to welcome Jeff Selingo. Jeff is the author of a book right now that we're going to talk about, but he's already had 2 New York Times bestsellers, College Unbound and There Is Life After College. And for more than 20 years, his in-depth reporting and storytelling have provided insight about the inner workings of universities and have given us a practical roadmap for higher ed's future to students, parents, college leaders, and business executives. He was a top editor at the Chronicle of Higher Ed for many years, and even had a stint at US News and World Report, where he interfaced with those college rankings that we always look at. His work has been honored with awards from the Education Writers Association, Society of Professional Journalists, and the Associated Press. Jeff's newest book, Who Gets In and Why, A Year Inside College Admissions, takes readers on a journey through the selection process from inside 3 admissions offices, Emory, Davidson, and University of Washington, and revealing what really matters to the gatekeepers and how the ultimate decisions often based on the college's priorities. This is a great book. I recommend it highly to everyone for really getting some insights in there. His new book is even more relevant now as pandemic has upended the college search for so many high school students. Who Gets In and Why gives you an insider's look at the field you'll be playing on, most likely for both the juniors and the seniors. I think they'll both be impacted, and so I'm glad we're going to be talking about that a little bit tonight. And this will help you to better understand the rules you're going to be following in the year ahead. Jeff received his bachelor's degree from Ithaca College and a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins University. He's a member of the Board of Trustees at Ithaca College. He lives with his wife and 2 daughters in Washington, D.C. Mr. Selingo's appearance is through the generosity of the New Canaan High School PFA, so shout out to them. And his book can be purchased at Elm Street Books here in town, directly from their website. So welcome all. Jeff, welcome.
It's great to be here, and wish I could be there with you all in person, but here we are.
Yep, here we are. Yes. Not a problem. We will figure this out as we go. So we're going to begin with just asking you to talk a little bit about your year in visiting with these universities. You chose 3 highly selective admissions universities, so I'd like to know why you chose those schools to look at, but also talk to us about what you experienced. What were the big takeaways, the surprises? Just talk about that for a little bit with us.
So I spent a year inside the admissions process, and not just at colleges and universities, but I also spent time with what I call the other players in this ecosystem. Those include seniors. The year I was following them, and I chose 3 seniors out of a couple of dozen that I was following. But I also got into all these influences on the college search, the direct marketing companies. So if you're a parent or a student, you're used to getting all that mail, either physical mail or email. I spent time with the college board, with the rankings, with financial aid consultants who work for colleges and decide if your son or daughter gets a couple $1,000 discount or the kid down the street gets a $10,000 discount, right? All those decisions are made by consultants that work off campus. So there's all these players in the background that you as a parent or applicant never see, but actually hugely influence not only where you apply, but whether you get in and whether you get money. But the bulk of the book is, as you said, Cynthia, is focused on the 3 colleges and universities that I spent time inside. Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina, Emory University in Atlanta, and then the University of Washington in Seattle. And you asked, why did I pick those 3? Well, as I say in the beginning of the book, I actually approached 24 universities, 24 in all. And those were the only 3 that said yes to my request. So in many ways, my colleges are almost as random as sometimes the admission system is for students. But there is some wisdom behind those 3. Once I decided I was going to do more than one university, so a great book on admissions 20 years ago didn't take place very far from where you are tonight. At Wesleyan, Jack Steinberg, a New York Times writer, did The Gatekeepers. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this book is I wanted to update that book. 20 years old, one university. I wanted to focus on 3 places. A small liberal arts college in Davidson, a big urban private university at Emory, and then a big public, because 80% of American students go to public universities. And so I wanted to show essentially the differences between these 3 places. The other reason I think this is important, because this book is useful to you even if you're not going to apply to any one of those 3 schools, because it describes the ecosystem that you're in, this playing field that you're going to be on. And in many ways, it also is why I encourage students and families when they're beginning the college search to ignore the names for a minute. And in many ways, I want you to ignore the names of the colleges in this book, especially if you're not going to apply for them. I want you to have the takeaways from the book instead. But it's the same way when you're beginning the college search. I always tell students and parents, go to colleges that are nearby, go to a small liberal arts college, go to a private university, go to a big public. Don't worry about the names yet, but get a sense of what a big public university is, what a small liberal arts college is. Do that nearby first without getting caught up in the names, because I think it gives you a sense for perhaps what type of place you might want to go to. Now, I know that's really difficult in this era right now when many colleges are closed or they're not doing tours, and we could talk about that a little bit later. So what stood out to me from these colleges? First is just how deep and wide the applicant pools are at these colleges. So I picked on purpose selective colleges and universities. And I think it's really important to remind the audience tonight that most colleges in the United States are not selective, meaning they admit more than 50% of the students who apply. So we always keep talking about how hard it is to get into college. In reality, it isn't. the average acceptance rate is 65% at American colleges, 65%. So there's only about 200 colleges that are considered selective, meaning they accept fewer than 50% of students. And I wanted to pick 3 selective colleges largely because that's where most of our focus is. That's where the applicants are abundant and the seats are scarce. And so I wanted to focus on those types of colleges. But I think it's really important to know, and I think it's really important when you're putting together your list to have a mix of institutions on your list. And hopefully we'll be talking about that later. But one of the things that really surprised me was just how wide and deep the applicant pools are. Just think about the context of your own school. You have a very great public school there. Parents and students might know of students at other schools in the area. You kind of know how you stack up against those students, but then just replicate that over and over and over again across the country. More than 40,000 high schools in the US. Now, a place like Emory, which the year I was there received 30,000 applications, they get applications from about 8,000 high schools. But those are 8,000, for the most part, pretty good and excellent high schools. And there was a moment when we're in the room reading applications and we come across yet another application with a 1490 or a 15 whatever on the SAT, 4.0 plus GPA. And you realize, didn't I just see this applicant, 5 applications ago? And it just shows you just how what is happening in your school is replicated elsewhere. Now, I'm not saying that to discourage you. I'm saying that to just really have a reality check about what your institutional list should look like, what your college list should look like. Because you may think you're competitive within your own high school, but then remember, you're going up against all these students elsewhere across the country. The second big takeaway is that admissions is really not about the applicant. And I think you need to go into the process knowing this. You may not like it. It's not a meritocracy. It never was. It never will be. It's kind of unfair. And we kind of have to accept that going into it and kind of try our best and let the chips fall where they may. But one of the things that I really discovered is that at the end of the day, college admissions is really a business. And every college has priorities. And what part of your goal in an applicant is to try to discover what those priorities might be. Some of this is through demonstrated interest. And hopefully we'll be talking about that tonight because they really want to know, some colleges really want to know if they're going to accept you, are you actually going to come? Are you going to enroll? Because they know you're applying to 7, 8, 10 other schools and they want to know that. But they also have a list of other priorities. Schools, for example, many national elite selective colleges want students from every state, for example. So they're very big on geographic diversity. And I point this out in the book. American higher ed is about 60% women now and 40% men. Most colleges want to keep close parity on gender. And so selective admissions for women is very tough in early decision and in regular decision. It's harder to get in as a female applicant. And we see that across the board, right? So again, these priorities matter where they want more men or they want more humanities majors and fewer STEM majors because they're overwhelmed, some schools, with STEM majors. This is where race, ethnicity come in as well. And then sometimes, and full pay students as well, or legacies. This also could be more narrow. They might have a great orchestra and they might want to fill the orchestra, or they have great sports teams, right? And they have to fill all those sports teams. So what I always remind students is that if you look at the acceptance rate and it says 25%, or I was, at Emory the year I was there, it was 15%. That doesn't mean if it's 25%, you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting in. It's different for everybody. And you have to realize the context you're in. And then finally, Cynthia, and then we'll go on to other questions, is one of the other things that I noticed is that really what the admissions officers are looking for, and I point this out in the book, is they're looking in the file, in the application, for the entirety of the teenager's story. And this is what I saw as I was reviewing applications for them and listening to them, is what I think many students are missing. Because you're all trying to finish, 6, 8, 10 applications, how many schools you're applying to in a short amount of time. And what you end up doing to save time is you cut and paste. Maybe you have a big Google Doc and you're working on multiple essays and short answers at the same time. And maybe you take your paragraph from your Boston College essay and use it for Emory or UCLA. So you're working on these multiple applications at a time instead of compiling them in sequence to really make the case of why you're the right fit for that college. And I saw the same thing, this consistency of story between recommendations and students as well. So for example, they might be reading a recommendation from a teacher or a counselor, and the counselor or the teacher might be talking about something the student is really passionate about or really interested in. And then the student will have no evidence of that really anywhere else in their application. So what you're trying to do is tell a complete story about you, and you're trying to make it as consistent as possible. Those are two very important details that I think sometimes get lost in our rush, especially at this time of year, to finish applications and this idea of kind of cutting and pasting from many different applications.
Right. We do see that trying to really tie it together as one is very important. Okay, so let's talk about testing a little bit.
Yep.
It's a huge concern right now for our students because in this area we have been through quite the year. Our kids have took the PSATs last October, and for many that was the last test they've been able to take. And they've been preparing and hoping to take it and signed up for tests, and then things have gotten canceled and changed up, and they see schools saying we're test optional, it'll be fine, we don't care, but parents and students are worrying about this. So first of all, if you could talk about how in admissions in the last year, how much importance were SATs and ACTs in the normal process of admissions, and then maybe how that possibly will look this year.
So I know this is hard to believe. They're less important than I think parents and students think they are.
Yeah.
Parents and students love these tests more than I think college administrators do. Now, I was at 3 schools, all 3 required SAT scores. And all 3 are pretty selective places. So, what I'm about to say is not true necessarily at every single institution. Some do care more about the ACT and SAT than others. But the other thing you have to realize about all the information we know about admissions today is that many students based on test scores, they self-select out of applying. So what ends up happening is that before COVID, then I'll talk about what's happening now. Most students would look at that middle 50% range, which is everywhere, right? It's in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. It's on Big Future that the College Board runs, right? You know what the SAT range is for most colleges. And what would end up happening is that most students applying, if they were outside of, or they're at the bottom half of that range, they just wouldn't apply. And so what you're seeing for most students coming into these institutions or applying to these institutions, their SAT scores are pretty consistent. And they're pretty consistent in a narrow band. And so they really don't give any other additional information to the admissions officer, right? All 3 of these institutions practice what's called holistic admissions. So they don't have cutoffs, right? There are some universities that have cutoffs for SAT scores, others that have essentially charts where if you have this combination of a GPA and that combination of an SAT, you're automatically admitted. None of these universities do that. They actually read and review all the applications. They give them scores. And the SAT in many cases, or ACT score, is combined with other academic factors that they consider are more important. And those 2 academic factors that all 3 of these colleges considered more important, particularly Emory and Davidson as privates, they really place weight on high school curriculum, meaning your class schedule, and grades, and the grades you got in that. And what they really want to know is they're getting from you, they get this high school profile. Every high school submits this profile with an application. And so they know what courses are available at your high school. And then they're looking at the student's transcript, and they want to know, did the student take the most rigorous courses available to them? This is particularly true, by the way, if you're majoring in the sciences and math. They want to know, did you take the highest level math? How many AP courses were available? Did you take them? What grades did you get in them? What are you doing your senior year? They pay a lot of attention to that sequence of courses. And are you doing it? And then what grades you got in those courses. Then they look at the, if there's something off about the transcript, grades are all over the place, which they don't really like. Consistent grades they love, upward trend they like. But if there's something they don't quite get about the transcript, maybe they're unsure of it, then they will look at the SAT score. But what they know from their own research at their own institutions, and Emory did this when they went through training with their admissions officers, is that the best predictor of success in college are high school grades and high school courses. And SAT is the third predictor of success, and it's really more of a predictor of freshman year grades. The other thing they know from their own research and from research even the College Board has done is that grades and test scores line up. In other words, for most students, if you have high grades, you're going to have high test scores. So they use it more as a check-in if they don't quite understand the high school. And in your high school case, the case of your high school, they probably know your high school pretty well because they get a lot of students from there every year. So, but if they get a high school where students don't apply very often, that will come in, the SAT will play and ACT will play a little bit more of a role. Or if there's something on the transcript that doesn't make sense, they will look at the score at that point. So again, a lot more emphasis is put on, I think, by the students and parents than the admissions officers. Now this year, do you want to talk about this year?
A little bit, yeah.
So I think what's important is that test optional is not new. 1,000+ colleges have been test optional for years. But what's new this year is that many more selective colleges are test optional, including the colleges that I followed. And I think what I just told you is critically important. The SAT is just one data point out of many. Now, in a typical year, a really good test optional school, so let's use an example of a test optional school, a really selective test optional school, University of Chicago. University of Chicago went test optional 3 years ago. And in a typical year, 85% of their students would still submit a score, even though they didn't have to, mainly because they were already applying to other schools with test scores. This year, the Dean of Admissions at Chicago tells me he expects maybe 50% of students to submit test scores under test optional. And the same is true everywhere. So if there's any year to be optional and not submit a score and not really worry about it, I think it's this year. Now, what I keep hearing from parents who are really trying to test is, yes, but my kid goes to a really highly competitive high school, like you're going there now. They have really good grades, and I just want something to differentiate them. The issue is I'm not quite sure the test score is going to differentiate them that much because everyone else who submits scores this year is also going to have high scores. In fact, in many ways, I think the average score at most schools will go up because the only people submitting will also be high scorers as well. So I'm not quite sure if I was going to focus and lean in on anything this year, I'm not sure I would focus on the testing. I would focus on other aspects of the application instead.
Okay. You sound like you're in our brains here. So thank you.
So kind of my turn now, Jeff. We're very interested in your take on ED.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
I'm hearing you. You're good.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. There's a lot being written about ED, and more people will go ED, especially if they have the resources. We're interested to know what you think about this, because we'd like to know how you think the pandemic will affect ED applications.
I will preface this by saying I don't like ED as a policy. I think it's a terrible policy. I point this out at the end of the book. I think it's one of the things we should do away with because what I think it does is and maybe this year is a little different. It pushes up the whole entire college application process well into the junior year of high school when students are still trying to figure themselves out and really trying to enjoy the third year of high school. And I think it puts way too much pressure on students. That said, so now I preface this, ED I think is going to be even more important this year. So I point out in the book, there's a whole chapter in the book on ED. And one of the things that I found in researching the book is that institutions have pulled the lever on ED harder every time they've run into trouble or worried about the future. And James Fallows wrote a piece in the Atlantic a long time ago about ED and traced the history all the way back to the 1950s and 60s. And this is consistently true. Every time institutions are worried about the near future, they go to ED. In fact, it's the reason why ED was started to begin with. One of the things I found in more recent history is that in 2008, during the Great Recession, most selective schools accepted about 25% of their overall class early, about 25%. It wasn't that large of a percentage. But that fall of 2008, when the Great Recession hit, many schools, many elite schools, selective schools, went up closer to 50%. And what's interesting is they never changed. They never moved back. So if you look at the ED rates, and again, we're really talking about selective schools here, because while many more schools have ED, ED really only is big at are big numbers at selective schools because students think they have an extra shot or a better shot in ED. And then we could talk a little bit more about, do you really have a better shot? But I think most colleges went up to 40, 45, 50% of their class ED, and they didn't go back. And that's still true today. Now, maybe to you, you're like, oh, 50%, that means they still have half the class to get through a regular decision. But the numbers it's just enormous, the difference between the amount of applications they get in early decision. So look at a place like Vanderbilt, which takes almost 50% of its students early, and they only get out of a couple thousand applications. And then they get something like 20,000 applications for regular, and they take the other 50%, but that's only 700 slots, right? So you're basically picking the rest of that 50% or 60% or whatever it is out of a much bigger pool of students. So that's why ED, especially at selective schools, is going to be, and I think most selective schools will push those numbers up even higher this year. I think if they're at 45, they'll move up to 50. If they're at 50, they'll move to 55. They'll push them up as high as they can. I don't think they can push them up much beyond like 60 or 70, because then the whole regular decision loses its meaning. Now, one note on, everybody thinks it's easier to get an ED. And for the most part, for many students, it is. So for example, I cite studies in the book for female applicants. It's easier to get in early decision. Still not as easy as it is for men, but it is easier to get in early decision. But the numbers, when you look at the numbers, you're like, oh, a lot fewer kids are applying, I might as well apply. But one of the things many people don't know is that, for example, at most colleges and universities, all the athletes come in early. So they're basically taking almost their entire roster of all their teams, or their incoming class of the roster, early decision. So that takes up a lot of spots just right there. So if you're a non-athlete, again, your chances then of getting in early go down a little bit. The second thing they're going to do is, if they don't think they can get somebody like you in regular decision, then they will more likely take those students early. So for example, if you're from a state that doesn't have a lot of applicants to that school, or a high school that doesn't, or there's just something else about you, going back to those institutional priorities, and they don't think they're going to get you in regular decision, they're going to take you in early decision. So one final thing, you asked about resources. Very important point here, because it's a binding early decision, different than early action, is a binding decision. And so if you get accepted, you're saying you're coming. And then it doesn't enable you to compare financial aid packages from other schools who might accept you later on in regular decision. So if financial aid is important to you, you may want to consider not applying early, or if you're going to, make sure you look at schools that are both need blind in admissions, which many selective schools are, but more important, meet full need. And they meet full need for their ED pool too, which means that you're probably, if you have financial need, you're probably going to get a pretty good package for early decision, and you may not do that much better in regular decision. It doesn't mean you won't get better packages from other institutions. I'm not saying that, but you're probably not going to do that much better from many institutions if you're applying early to an institution that meets full need. And I think that's an important question to ask.
So what happens if you are a student who has decided that you're really not ready to commit? You don't want to do early decision. Maybe you don't even want to do early decision two. Um, you're keeping your options open. Do you have any advice for someone like that? How they can kind of differentiate themselves? Because ultimately, when they do have one or two schools in their minds after these deadlines have passed, how can they
Yep.
how can they help their application stand out, if you
Well,
want?
that's where I think, so first of all, if you're not sure, don't do it. I met too many students who use early decision as a strategy. They know they're going early somewhere and they're always trying to guess at the numbers. Where is it better for me to apply? That's not a great strategy because you're going to end up, first of all, you may still not get in. But I met students who did that and got because they didn't love the place. Early decision was meant for those people who really love the place and really want to go there. And that's the way you should use it. Now, for those students who don't quite know, they have a couple of different places. I think this is where, especially for institutions that care about demonstrated interest, and many institutions will put this on their common data set. They'll mark that they do pay attention to demonstrated interest. So I'm saying a couple of things here that maybe some of the audience might not know about. Common data set is a selection, pages upon pages of critical numbers that colleges report to places like US News and World Report. Most colleges place those on their website. If you just Google the college you're interested in and the common data set, you'll probably pull up the most recent year. Not every college lists it, but almost everyone does put those up there. That'll tell you how many applications they got. That middle 50%, they'll give you a lot of data that is actually really interesting and good for you to know about. Usually there they'll mark if they care about demonstrated interest. I don't know how accurate that is all the time because I know there are schools that do care about demonstrated interest and don't say they do. What is demonstrated interest? They want to know, again earlier, as I said, if you're applying to 8 or 10 schools, how likely are you, if we accept you, to get in here? And why is that important? All these selective schools want to keep their yield numbers up, meaning the percentage of students who apply, who get accepted and say yes. So at Davidson, I talk a lot about this in the book. It's called likelihood to enroll, LTE. It comes up all the time while they're reading applications or in committee. What is the LTE? What is the likelihood of this student to enroll? How do they determine that? A million different ways. And it's a little bit different now because of COVID, but they're looking at, they send you an email and it has a unique code in there. Have you clicked on that code? Once you click on that code, that usually puts a cookie on your web browser. As you're going, or how often do you visit their website? What pages do you visit on their website? If you say you're going to major in engineering, are you actually going to visit the engineering page? A little bit different this year, but normally in the past, if the admissions officer came to your school, did you go visit? Did you visit that person? Did you go visit the school? Did you have interactions with the institution? Did you like their Facebook page and their Instagram posts? Like, how much interaction do you have? And right now, what they're looking for, and I know that they're looking for this, is are you showing up to the Zoom meetings that they're having, and things like that. So demonstrated interest is critical to some schools. And I'll tell you, and I quote this study in the book that I found fascinating, and I did see this in admissions. Demonstrated interest is actually more important to, in many cases, your foundational schools, meaning the schools you think you're going to get into because you have better academic credentials. Those schools, when they see you have really good academic credentials, maybe better than kind of their class, sometimes they might reject you just because they think you're using them as a safety. And they don't want to be your second choice. So I point this out in the book, so I'm not telling stories out of school here. Tulane is famous for this. This is exactly what Tulane does. Tulane doesn't like to be people's second choice because they're too often people's second choice. So they look closely at demonstrated interest, and they want to know, especially if you have really good test scores, if you have them, or grades, they want to know how interested are you, because they will reject you if you're not, because they don't want to accept you and then you say no to them, because too many students have done that. So that's, if you're looking at a school and you're really interested in it, and you might say, well, my scores are better or my grades are better, this is not the exact match, but I really want to go to the school, then you better show demonstrated interest in that school.
And I would think in this, with the pandemic, that all those clicks and showing up virtually is really the only way they're going to be able to see that level of interest unless they open their campuses soon.
Right. And I think, Cynthia, I think it's going to be even more important this year because every college is worried about enrollment. And so they want to, again, they want to make sure that yield turns up high or keeps
Mhm.
high. They have all these models that they use year after year. So I think it's going to be even more important this year.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, given all of that, then what pieces of the application do you think are going to be really important then?
Yeah. So I think they're going to lean in on grades and course selection because they're feeling, meaning the admissions officers, and I've been talking to the deans, not only I spent time with, but other deans as well. Their contention is that course selection shouldn't have really changed, right? Your high school courses are the high school courses you would have picked, whether you're online, hybrid, or face-to-face. I don't know what you did at your school last spring. Obviously, some schools went pass fail last spring. That's going to create a little bit of an anomaly, but they still have grades from other years of high school. Some schools might look a little further back. Many schools don't look at freshman year grades, for example, from high school. They might look a little further back. So they're definitely going to lean in a lot heavier on grades and high school curriculum. I think they'll look much more closely at recommendations this year to get a sense of what is the growth of this potential student. So this is really curious to me as I was watching them read recommendations. What they're really looking for, especially from high schools like yours, are the students going to come here and just kind of coast? Or are they going to come here and really continue to grow, problem solve, be creative, do things, work really hard? That's what they're looking for. And they want to know what is the growth mindset of these students. So for example, one strategy I might use this year is if you had a teacher that taught you more than once in high school, and maybe they saw you sophomore year and now junior year or senior year, great place to get a recommendation because they're able to kind of see that trajectory. Because that's what these colleges, especially from schools like yours, they really want to see that this student has been going like this, just getting better and better every year. And we understand that COVID might have put a little damper on that. But they want to see that you're going to continue on that upward trajectory. So I think they're going to lean in more on recommendations. Essays are kind of a mixed bag for most of these colleges and universities. The really good ones help. The really bad ones, obviously probably other parts of the application are not great either. But most of them are so similar. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of essays about COVID this year. So don't write about it unless it really impacted you. And obviously there's another question on the applications about that anyway. But they're so similar that for the most part, they don't really help somebody or usually never hurt somebody either. It's the really good ones, the ones that are just not overly curated, meaning clearly the student thought about this and read and wrote about it. He didn't or she didn't look in books and say, oh, what should I be writing about? It just really comes from the heart. It shows this idea that they've learned, they're a problem solver, things like that. Those are the essays that really stand out. But I will tell you, in a course of a day at an Emory, for example, or at a Davidson, where we might be doing 10 applications an hour, reading 10 applications an hour, there might be one that stands out in the essay. So the essay is, again, it's a data point. They might lean into it a little bit more heavily this year, maybe not. One thing, and this may be an advantage to you this year, I think they're also going to lean heavier into high schools that they know. So one thing that I could imagine them doing, and then talking to other deans about this as well, is that they might go a little bit deeper into a high school. So if they got 30 apps from a high school in a typical year, and maybe they took 10 or 15 or whatever, or 10, they might take 15 this year, right? They might take more applications because they're confident of that high school, confident of the students in that high school.
Your lips to God's ears there. That's what we're hoping for. So, that'll be very nice. So we've had a lot of people also worrying about students who this year as seniors, when they graduated, are home. Yep. They're taking a gap year, they're taking courses, they're doing other things. And big question keeps coming up, how will that impact that class, for, for this current class now applying to college?
This is an amazing question. I get this every time I do a session. And I've checked, and I checked with so many different enrollment management people on this, like, and that, the people who really run these enrollment operations at these colleges and universities, to make sure that I'm thinking of this correctly. And this is the same way they're thinking about it. Most colleges and universities think about their enrollment as undergraduate enrollment, 5,000, 6,000, Emory, 7,000. They want that pretty even from year to year. This year, obviously, not so great, right? Because many of these, and it's not as high as we thought it was going to be, but maybe 20, 30% of the class took a gap year, deferred. So those students will now, some of those students might decide to apply elsewhere, to be honest with you, and not come back at all to that school. So there will be some drop off of that. But those students now will be freshmen with this year's high school graduating class. So I understand what you're saying, what most people are thinking. Well, they're taking my spot because of that. But remember, they want that overall enrollment number to stay consistent. So now they're going to have a smaller than normal sophomore class. So they have to make up for that somehow. I think they're going to take more transfer students into that sophomore class to try to get those numbers up. But if they can handle it, and for the most part they can add some more class sections. As long as they have room on campus, if they have to house every freshman, they're going to take a bigger freshman class as well. So the impact of this, maybe at the most, maybe at a Harvard or Yale, maybe, but for the most part, they need money. They want these students. They don't want suddenly their overall enrollment to go from 7,000 to 6,500 or even just dip by 100. Those numbers really matter to them. So they're going to make it up somehow. And I think they will make it up through a bigger freshman class in some cases.
Yeah. We're hoping.
So in other words, don't worry about it.
Okay. We're not going to worry about that.
Plus, it's something you can't control anyway.
Right. Well, this is true. That's how we seem to be moving forward. There's lots we can't control, but you still have to write the applications. Yeah. You still have to get the recommendations. You still have to move forward and get things out. So we won't think, we try to put that all on a back burner and worry about the other things as they come. So, and then talk to us a little bit about U.S. News and World Reports and their rankings. How should they be using them this year? And just to sort of as part of their research and their search, it's always been important to our community that these schools are highly ranked, but what do you think? Should they even use them at this point?
So I have a whole chapter in the book about Northeastern is the story I use. And as you mentioned earlier, I interned at US News back in the 90s on the College Guide. So I saw how the sausage was made. The rankings are just, again, it's a data source. Yeah. I would use them as a guide, but don't use them as a driver of your decision. I think what the rankings do is narrow your focus on a certain set of schools that may be a good fit for you, but there may be other schools that you're not seeing as a result. In many ways, this year might be good for that because you can't travel to many of these schools anyway. You might be able to zoom into a school that you wouldn't have considered, look at YouTube videos, connect with students, which I highly encourage you to do, by the way. Look beyond the normal stages. Maybe an alum of that place. Maybe some graduates who had graduated a couple of years ago from your high school who went to a school and you could connect with them. I would try to look beyond the official channels, YouTube, day in the life videos, Reddit, all these other things on the web, I think are really good sources for trying to develop a full picture of what a university is like. I understand it's not the same as being there. But the thing that the rankings, I think, do is limit that. And I'm hoping that people will broaden their horizons this year. The other thing about the rankings, though, I think to remember is that there's not a huge difference. There's not a big difference between 1 in 10 and 1 in 15. There is a big difference between 1 in 100. But most students are applying to colleges within certain ranges. Maybe they're all applying to top 25 schools. They're all applying to 25 to 50 or 50 to 75. And for the most part, we're making distinctions between those schools when there really aren't any academically. And the best thing you can do is go to a school where there's a good academic fit, a good social fit, and a good financial fit. And on the academics, and I say this in the book, you want to be swimming in a stream with students like you. So you don't want to be way ahead. So if you're high academics and you go to a lower academic school, you're not going to be challenged. You don't want to also be swimming behind all the time because you're going to be challenged too much. You kind of want to be right there in the middle with everybody else. And so that's where I would use the U.S. News and World Report rankings as a guide for the types of schools. I'm kind of in the center of this academically. What are some of the schools around me that I can apply to? But don't keep going for those top schools because first of all, everybody else is, and your chances of getting in are not great. They really aren't. And so maybe have one or two of them on your list, but have a balanced list of institutions at different areas of that. And again, when you take the entirety of your list, you might have, maybe one or two top ranked schools, one or two in the middle, but the entirety is not going to be 1 to 200. It's going to, all your schools are going to fall within a 1 to 50 probably, or 50 to 100 range.
Yeah, good.
Jeff, you've been talking about demonstrated interest and the fact that they can't be on campus. Is it worthwhile for a student who has an idea of their major to maybe find somebody through a web search, a professor or something like this, email them, and then mention that somehow? I think it's very hard for our students because they basically all go on the road at some point in the spring.
Yep.
And they haven't been able to do this. And they're doing things like looking at the virtual tours and things like this. Is there anything else that you think might help?
Yes, I think getting in touch with professors is helpful. It may help in demonstrated interest. Some institutions are tracking that, but not all professors will tell the admissions office, "Oh, hey, I talked to this student." But it also just helps to understand the professors. Many schools are allowing you into their classes to watch this year. Again, talking to individual professors might help. They might recommend students or recent alums. It requires a little bit more work on your part. It's not like showing up at a campus information session and having people talk at you, but it also gives you a chance to understand, are you finding people who are helpful? Are you finding people who are passionate about the place? I think the more you do that, the more you start to see the distinctions, not only between the students. So if you find a bunch of recent alums or current students, you pretty quickly could distinguish the differences between students at one school and the other and how they talk about it, or professors and how engaged they are. I had a senior tell me a couple of days ago that they reached out to a couple of professors at different schools and some never got back to them. I said, that tells you a lot, right? Because you're going to be a student someday at that school. Are they going to get back to you when you're a student, right? So I think those signals tell you a lot about the school. So I would definitely try them.
All right, let's take a few minutes with some questions.
Yeah, I see a bunch of them.
A lot of them popping up here,
Yeah.
and I thought maybe we could get
Yeah,
to
we can move through. I can move through these quickly if you want to ask me the ones that you think are.
Okay.
relevant.
All
Yeah,
right.
so I'll kind of call out a few, and then if there's any you see that you want to jump in on, absolutely feel free. But I think that a big theme that people are wondering is, if we can't get to the school and we can't visit or talk to people, how are we, one, determining if we should be EDing to a school, and what are the best and most effective ways to demonstrate interest to these places?
So if you can't get to a school and you're not sure, I would not try to ED. It's just not worth it if you're not sure. You might have more than one chance, by the way. I know I see in the questions, obviously ED means early decision. Many schools have early decision 1, 2, and I'm hearing some schools might add early decision 3 this year. And all of these have different deadlines. Early decision 1 is usually beginning of November. Early decision 2 is sometimes late in December, early January. They might add an early decision 3 sometimes in January. So in other words, you don't just have one chance at ED at some of these schools, so you may have another one. Demonstrated interest. And how do you know if they use demonstrated interest? As I said, the common data set does have a question on that. I find it not accurate all the time. I see schools that don't mark it, and I know they follow it. You can ask the school. Some schools are very open about that they use demonstrated interest. You could look around. There's a lot out there on the web, not all of it accurate, but some people are talking about schools that do use it. I will tell you, I know Tulane is a big one for that. Really, I think one of the ways you can tell if they tell, one secret way I think of telling it, if they don't say it, is look at that yield number. So most selective colleges, and again, you can find this on a common data set. So yield is the percentage of students who get, who have been accepted, who say yes to the offer. Harvard, 75, 80% their yield is. So that means 80% of the students who get accepted there say yes. Very low selective colleges, like non-selective colleges, they might only get 10% of their students, right? So they're accepting all these students and most of them say no. On average, a selective school should be in the 25, 35, 40% range. If you see some in the 20 range, and they're considered selective, meaning they kind of compete with the other schools that you're applying to, I have a feeling they're probably looking at demonstrated interest because they're trying to get that number up. That's the key here. If they have a low yield compared to the other schools you're looking at, I would just put together a list of all the schools and look at their yield numbers. And any ones that are low compared to the others, I have a feeling that they're probably looking at demonstrated interest because that's the number they want to get up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Great, thank you. And can you maybe talk a little bit about how early action might play into this year? And for those who don't know, early action is more of a non-binding application option.
Yeah, I mean, I think that many schools will probably increase the number of students that they accept early action. Again, I think what they're trying to do is get as many students in the pipeline as possible because they're really worried about students melting off in the spring with better financial aid offers and things like that. So early action is not binding, as you said. You get an early, you get an acceptance or a denial early, but you don't have to make the decision until May.
One question that I see here that I just wanted to jump in on is how much does a selected potential occupation come into play? Like if you say you want to be an accountant, an actuary, architect.
So it depends on, are you saying around major, most institutions don't, most institutions, except some of the big publics, don't admit by major. So University of Washington, I point out in the book, does admit by major because they have constraints on it. So engineering, computer science. So if you don't get accepted into it, they tell you that because you can't usually switch majors once you're there. If the school allows you to switch majors once you're there, most of the time they are not admitting numbers based on major. Yet they still look at them because they know that for many students, that is their intended major. They may not switch. They also know a lot of other students switch. So they're going to look at that. And they want to make sure they have a balance. They want to make sure they don't have too many STEM majors and not enough humanities majors. So they are looking at balance, but they're not totally denying you if they really like you and they say, well, we just don't have enough room in this major, because they're not counting their numbers like that. They're looking overall at balance. And an occupation. One of the things that I find very frustrating, and this was in the Wall Street Journal excerpt that I had, and I talk about this in the book, is in very competitive programs, they are looking for some sort of real interest in that occupation. So if you say you want to be an architect, I can't believe I'm saying this because I can't believe they even look for this. You know, did you intern at an architectural firm? Did you take an architectural course online? You know, they're looking for something beyond, because again, at a school where a major might be really popular, there are tons of students saying the same thing. So they're looking for that one thing that is different. And that's particularly at a place like Emory where sciences are really important. They look for that one thing that might be different.
And that goes back to what you said about tying things together a little bit.
Yes.
If you say you want to be a bio major, but never did anything extraordinary with sciences, then it's going to have an impact.
I'm seeing some questions over here. I could draw. So 6 minutes per application. Average is about 8 at some of these schools, but that's not a solid number. Some I saw were done in 5 minutes, and some took 15 minutes on the first read. So normally what most of these schools are doing is a first read, a second read. Increasingly, many of these schools that are overwhelmed with applications, like I described at Emory, they're using what's called a committee-based read. So they have 2 readers on the first read, and they split the application in half. One reader's looking at the high school record, the other person's looking at all the other stuff in the application, and they go back and forth. They feel like they can move through applications faster. Where's your eye drawn first? Even in those team reads, high school grades and curriculum, and usually curriculum. They open up that transcript and they look down and they can see what courses the student took. Most of the time, as in your case, they'll know the high school pretty well, and they'll immediately, where their eye will be drawn, they'll look at the intended major, say it's sciences, again, math. How many sciences and math did they take? They'll even sometimes count them up. That's what they're going to look at first. That's really kind of get you into the pool.
Yeah.
I know you spoke a bit about the overall, numbers for a school being hopefully and potentially more important than the incoming class with deferrals and such. Does that same idea apply to international students who may or may not be able to travel for school this year?
Meaning many schools are going to have fewer international enrollments. And again,
Right.
they're going to want to make those up. Schools need money right now, no doubt about it. And so I think they're going to do everything in their power to make sure their class is enrolled fully or over-enrolled.
Great. And how do you see these changes, so many schools going test optional as one example, playing out into the future after hopefully, COVID is a distant memory and application goes back to normal? How do you see all this playing out?
I think that many schools will stay test optional because they'll probably be able to enroll a very similar class academically. They'll get more applications, which they always love for the most part. And it's just easier. I think there will be a set of schools, largely the Ivies and some other probably big state universities that really like the tests. They'll stay with it. But I think we are moving to a future where test optional is going to become much more of the norm. And then eventually I think the tests will lose their meaning because in a test optional world where it's the norm, only the students who score high will take the test and submit it, and then they lose all meaning in admissions offices.
Okay.
I see a couple of other questions here. Do senior year courses and grades affect your application much? Yes, they always have. They always are. Even in early decision, they're looking for those first quarter or first semester grades. I think it's actually going to be even more important this year. Particularly, there were some schools that were test pass-fail in the spring, and they are not doing pass-fail this fall. So they're going to want to look at those fall grades, particularly this year.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Yeah. Best way to identify schools' unset priorities. That's really hard, to be honest with you. That's why they're unsaid. But I think the more you can read about them, the more where their president is saying, we want to become a national university. That means they want to break out of their where they're normally drawing applications from. How much do sports play a role? Because they're probably going to take more athletes, right? Things like that. The more you could try to read about them, the better you are there. Eric, I don't know if you see any other questions that you
a few have come in just related to students who are able to take SATs. How important do you think it is that they're fitting in a subject test as they're available? A few people have asked that.
Most schools have gone away with the subject test, so I don't think it's that important.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you're applying to a test optional school and your score is not great or it's not in that middle, don't submit it. There's no reason to submit it. So if you're going to take a test and get a score and it's great, submit it, but otherwise don't submit it, especially this year.
Yeah. Great. Okay, just final question, the end of the night kind of question. What one piece of advice would you offer to students, especially our seniors? And then what would you say to their parents?
This is going to sound like a cliche, but the world is kind of out of control right now. And so is admissions. And there's only so much you can control and control what you can. So focus on those parts of the application. My personal feeling is rather than try to rush all around the Northeast, trying to find a testing site where you can take a test, sitting with a mask for a 4-hour test, it's not really necessary. I don't know how much it's really going to help you. And so instead of that time, focus on the application, focus on making your essay better, focus on your senior year courses and your grades, focus on investigating colleges more and going to their programs online. Spend that time. I think that time is better spent on those activities than it is on trying to go get a test, particularly this year, or on trying to panic about anything else. I think really focusing on those parts of the application that you as a student have control over. That's the advice to the students. The advice to the parents is that, be with your son or daughter. I always tell parents, kind of be that nudge, but don't be the nag on them, right? This is supposed to be a learning process. And again, it's going to sound like a cliche, but the students that I found were happiest at the end of this process, the couple dozen that I followed, I only profiled 3 in the book, but the couple dozen I followed were those that really use this as a learning process and changed their mind during the process. Some schools went up, some schools went down. They didn't get into a place and they were fine with that because that whole list was really good. And there were a couple other schools they liked on it anyway. The students that were least happy were those that had their mind set on something, that didn't want to change it, where their parents were pressuring them. And they ended up at schools that they weren't really thrilled with. And even those students who didn't get into school, their schools that they really wanted to get into, they ended up at a place that they really like. And for most students, that's going to happen. And then the final piece of advice for both sides, everybody's in this. And that's the thing that I think is going to be really different. So I was sitting in these rooms, they'd be reading applications or reading essays about something that happened to a student that was the most tragic thing that you could imagine. And it's really hard as an admissions officer to have any empathy for a lot of these things because you just keep reading about, somebody's father passed away, somebody's parent lost a job, things like that. This year, everybody has gone through this situation. Admissions officers get it. They're going to be, I think, more flexible in this process. And so take a little solace in that. I mean, I don't think it's going to necessarily be any easier, but they do understand that your application's not going to have everything it normally would have.
Jeff, thank you so much. It was a very quick hour that we just—
I know, unfortunately.
It went very quickly. This has been recorded and we will post it as soon as we can in the next day or so. And I do encourage people to buy your book and go to the link to the Elm Street bookstore and take a look because there's a lot of great information in there and gives you a really good sense of this process.
Yeah, and again, I am trying to sell books, but to be honest with you, but I mean, there are a lot of questions here and I'm really sorry we couldn't get to them. I think there is enough information in the book that gives you a sense of what's important and what's not. And as I said earlier at the very beginning, whether you're applying to these schools or not, the process is different at every school, but the basic things that they're looking at are pretty consistent from school to school. They measure them slightly different. They put different weights on them, but the process is pretty similar among selective schools.
Good. And I think that's a good information for all of us to have. Many of the questions, people out there, your counselors can help you with the answers there as well. So
that's one other thing. Go with the advice of your counselors. You have great counselors there. A lot of these questions are very specific. I don't know you, so I don't know your background. I don't know what you've done in high school. So you might be asking a very specific question. I think your counselor is much more qualified than I am to answer.
Yeah. We have a good team here. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know everyone did appreciate all your answers here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Stay safe. Stay strong.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.